This movie brought to you by the Freedom Collective and the Osboy Files.
On October the 12th, 2002, Australia was shocked. Australia was horrified when a huge explosion ripped apart the Sari club in Kuta Bali. There has never been an explosion similar to this before. There has never been an explosion similar to this afterwards. This was, for all intents and purposes, yet another false flag operation by governments willing to introduce anti-terror laws and legislation. Unfortunately for them, we've picked up their trail. This video here today is going to show you that this secret is now being exposed. That they left their fingerprints at the crime scene. There has been more than one person that has picked up this trail. Indeed, there have been a lot of people investigating this since the day. And despite the Australian Federal Police bringing out their own version of events, we here today will bring you exactly what happened at the Sari Club that fateful night. In this particular video today, we ask, was the Sari Club bombing an inside job? You see, it appears a few people were in the know about the impending 2002 Bali bombings. Except those, of course, who really needed to know the most. The victims. In this clip here, we examine the evidence to date and let you decide. Whenever a good investigator begins an investigation of a crime, the first thing he or she asks themselves is who benefited, who managed to benefit from this particular act. In this particular clip here, we're going to look at the who, why, and how of Bali 2002. When looking at the Bali bombings from an Australian perspective, we remember all the stories that we were told completely through the eyes of the media. We relied on the print media, the television media, and of course the internet and radio. We saw first-hand accounts, eyewitness testimony, police statements. Thus we thought we got the full picture of the story. Or did we? At a first glance, the case appears very neatly wrapped up. That some mad Islamic suicide bombers from a local angry youth religious group blows himself up, along with a whole heap of Westerners. However, is the story as simple as that? In this, we're going to look at all the data. We'll look at the material facts, the scientific data, the analysis of the eyewitness statements, and the statements made since then. We're going to have a look at some photographic evidence, much of which has never been seen before. When you look at this, one begins to get a disturbing picture that the official story of Jamaah Islamiyah, part-time chicken farmers making a lethal military device, is nothing more than a thin veil of carefully concocted lies. We find out in here that there was more than one bullet fired from the grassy knoll outside the Sari Club that night on Kuta Beach. The real bombers, it seems, got away from Jakarta Airport that night, leaving a trail that we have found. It should really not surprise anybody to know that before September 11, the Patriot Act and the new terror laws were waiting on the desks of the Western leaders, just waiting for one act to bring these into existence, to bring them up onto the cards so the politicians can introduce them into their respective countries. In the UK and Tony Blair's government, in Australia with John Howard's government, and of course the United States. In the United States itself, the Patriot Act was written long before 9/11 and was waiting for that one event to be introduced. Such is the same with the Bali bombings. The new anti-terror laws that John Howard introduced had been waiting on the cards, waiting for such an event to take place. When the Australian government under John Howard first hinted at involvement in Afghanistan, and of course subsequently involvement in Iraq, the Australian people reacted, protesting in numbers that have not been seen since the Vietnam War. Moms and dads, kids of all ages took to the street, school children organizing protests in their classes. We saw a wave of protest action against the Howard plans to involve Australian troops in countries where we had no place to be. It was no surprise to learn that a lot of these places actually contained a lot of resources. The pipeline in the Caspian Sea going to the new emerging third world countries like India and China. This had a great deal to do with power, a great deal to do with a grab at resources. but very little to do with the War on Terror. Following the September 11 attacks, more Australians had taken to the streets in protest against George W. Bush and John Howard's plan to invade a sovereign nation like Iraq and Afghanistan. Now, 1 million Australians taking to the street in protest was a very serious blow against the Bush administration plans and against Vice President Dick Cheney and the neocon plans, the PNAC agenda, their ambitions to seek control of the world's resources. Just as Hitler had done, just as Stalin and Pinochet had done, these dictators all turned on their own people who refused to go along with their plans. Thus was born the Bali bombings plan. It should also surprise nobody to know that the War on Terror itself was a Benjamin Netanyahu invention, created by the Israelis back in 1985. They too were waiting for the right moment to introduce this legislation, to introduce this idea that they could have a war on an objective. It's a bit like having a war on criminalization, or a war on bad manners. You can't really shoot it, you can't really fight it, because terror is something that the government really has had a long history of doing against their own people. When John Howard made it known to George W. Bush that the Australian people were not accepting their fake war on terror, the Australian people were not accepting that there was any threat from Afghanistan or Iraq, George W. Bush then replied to the Prime Minister of Australia, and I quote, "Maybe you people should realize that terrorism knows no borders, and I would hope that these crazies don't attack you." Howard replied, according to the transcripts, that in the case of a perceived, listen to that word, a perceived Muslim attack on Australians, he would certainly have the full support of the Australian people. Shortly after that, George W. Bush approached George Tenet. The CIA director and the Mossad have very close relations, Tenet himself being a dual citizen Israeli. A discussion was held in Langley between Tenet and a top Mossad official, and assurances were given by him that he could assist in helping out the situation in Australia. Shortly after that, the Bali bombings occurred.
I talked to this girl called Lorraine.